Good morning and welcome to the 29th meeting of the Public Audit and Post-Legislative Scrutiny Committee in 2019. Can I ask everyone in the public gallery to please switch off or turn your devices to silence this morning so they don't affect the committee's work. Item 1 is decision on taking business in private. Do members agree to take items 4 and 5 in private this morning? Thank you. Item 2 is another decision on taking business in private. Do members agree to take draft reports on post-legislative scrutiny of the Freedom of Information Scotland Act 2002, the 2018-19 audit of the Scottish Prison Service and the Scottish Public Pensions Agency update on management of PS project in private at future meetings? Thank you very much. Item 3 is post-legislative scrutiny of the Freedom of Information Scotland Act 2002. I'd like to welcome our witnesses to the committee meeting this morning: Graham Day, Minister for Parliament Business and Veterans, Jerry Hendricks, Head of the FOI Unit, and Graham Crombie, Head of Policy and Casework from the Scottish Government. Thank you all for coming. I understand that the Minister doesn't want to make an opening statement this morning, so we're going to move straight to questions, and I'm going to ask Alec Neil to open questioning for the committee.
Okay, good morning, Minister. As you know, there's been some concern about the unavailability of information from private companies delivering public contracts. So can I ask your view on, should private companies delivering public contracts be subject to freedom of information, and should that be limited to matters relating to the public contracts, or should it be wider?
Okay, thank you. Insofar as the delivery of public service contracts goes, our view is that private companies or any organisations should in principle be captured. But I think we would need, as you've alluded to be clear as to what amongst their activities would and should be captured by FOISA. Clearly, the activities which are publicly funded absolutely should, but we have to be careful to ensure that FOISA captures only the public service element of the work and not anything else which led perhaps to their competitors gaining a commercial advantage in an area of non-public business. I know that the Commissioner has been very clear on what he's looking for by way of the extension to FOISA. I think he said it was to provide public services, where they provide public services on behalf of the public sector. And that essentially is what our recently closed consultation is exploring. I think also the factors approach that he suggested might be a proportionate way to proceed in terms of making those safeguards. And essentially that's what we do at the moment. I guess the only debate would be around what factors should be considered.
I mean, can I give a hypothetical situation? I mean, one of the many advantages of Brexit will be that we will have a great deal more flexibility in relation to the procurement rules. And as you know, a number of years ago, when we reformed procurement, we wanted to include a provision in the statute that in order to compete for any public sector contract, you had to be a living wage company. So is that an example of where you would want to capture information about the whole of the company and not just the bit that's delivering the public sector contracts, if we made that a condition of getting public procurement contracts?
Well, I'm not sure I agree with about too many advantages to Brexit. We'll have to agree to disagree on that. This government's very clear about its fair work agenda, so I would make that point. But I don't at this stage feel we should be speculating on exactly what should be captured by the extension we're proposing. We have to consider the consultation findings, which we're just beginning to do. And once we've done that, we will be clearer and we will make clear what our thoughts are in terms of the shape the extension ought to take.
We're looking at practice in other countries. I mean, obviously, some of the Scandinavian countries, for example, have had this kind of legislation for a very, very long time. You're looking at, as well as the consultation internally in Scotland, are you looking at practice elsewhere?
Well, let me bring in one of the team to answer that.
Thank you. Yes, I can confirm that certainly within the past year, the FOI unit has undertaken some international comparison work to see what approaches to coverage are taken in countries, not just in Europe, but throughout the world. And we are considering the outputs from that report.
So when you publish your report, will you provide the information in the comparators?
Happy to provide that to the committee.
Yeah, that would be I think that would be very helpful, actually.
Yeah.
Very helpful indeed. It would help inform our report as well.
How quickly could we do that?
I think we can do that relatively quickly. We've had the information now.
Okay.
You can leave it till after your day.
We'll get that to you, convener.
My second question is in relation to companies or agencies wholly owned by the Scottish Government are subject to FOI, but companies which are jointly owned with another organisation, sometimes another public organisation, are not currently subject to FOI. That seems to be a bit of a contradiction. So what are the government's thoughts at this stage on extending FOI requirements to those subsidiaries that are jointly owned?
I think I would use the word an anomaly.
Yes.
And I think, as we've indicated previously, it's something certainly we would consider worth looking at.
Yeah. And that's part of what you're going to be pronouncing on when you eventually...
Well, there's an opportunity with the next extension for us to consider. We've deliberately drawn the consultation quite widely.
Yeah.
And as I say, I think, and we'll look forward to the committee's report, obviously, and you may well draw that to our attention.
Yeah.
At what point we'll be able to address it, I don't want to commit today on, but absolutely, there's a case being made there.
Yeah.
Could I say, though, I wouldn't expect us to directly address this as part of our consultation, because the Act is framed in such a way that it's only companies that are wholly owned. So I would be looking for evidence from the committee and in its report that may look at how we take that forward in legislation going forward.
Right. I mean, why should that be a restriction for you to look at it at the moment? Because it's in the legislation. There's loads of things in the legislation you're going to be looking at, or not in the legislation that you should be looking at.
No, well, this is to extend the reach of FOISA.
Yeah, perhaps I can clarify slightly. So the extension consultation is to use the existing powers that are in the legislation to make secondary legislation by way of extension. The point that has been raised is one which would require, we understand, primary legislation to change Section 6 of the Act to capture the matters that you've raised.
Yeah. So again, the committee report could help inform your position. I mean, I don't want to in any way preempt what we're likely to say, but speaking personally, it seems to me that primary legislation probably needs to be used to rectify some of the anomalies, some of the gaps and all the rest of it. So either way, whether it's secondary or primary, obviously you can do secondary quicker than you can do primary, but it shouldn't be a barrier to doing anything, whatever type of legislation is required.
Well, we'll clearly be open to considering what the committee brings back, and if it's a primary legislation situation, obviously that takes longer.
Yeah.
But if there are things we could reasonably do using secondary legislation, happy to look at that.
Right. Good. Okay. Thank you.
On a practical point, Minister, do you think there's sufficient time left in this Parliament to push any of these changes through?
If it's primary legislation we're talking about, I think that's highly unlikely, to be honest. If it's things that we can do using secondary legislation, then the option's there, certainly. Okay. But that shouldn't be a barrier to us following up on your report
no, indeed.
Setting a direction of travel insofar as we can.
I'm very encouraged by your answers to Mr Neil, especially your first answer that you think the government thinks private companies should be captured to the extent that they provide public contracts. And I think you'll find in terms of I'm sure you've read the evidence that we've heard, but the evidence from Unison springs to mind. Glasgow City Council, who said there's a private company who provide the milk to Glasgow City Council. We wouldn't expect FOI on all of that company's business, and I think we all would agree to be reasonable here, and I hope you will find our report reasonable in that regard as well. But to move on, Alec Neil asked you about private companies and then organisations that are partly owned by the Scottish Government and another public authority. You said that was an anomaly. There are, of course, other examples here. And some that spring to mind at the moment are third sector organisations that receive substantial amounts of government funding. I would use the example of the Equality Network, which I understand 90% of its funding comes from government sources, either central or other government sources. In effect, it is a public body or a publicly controlled body because it's publicly funded. Should organisations like that perhaps go over the 50% funding threshold fall under the gambit of FOI also?
I think in principle, yes, would be the answer. We're very careful that this is not just about private companies. There is an argument for capturing organisations of that nature as well. I fully accept that. What I would caution against, however, is I think it was Unison and Unite talked about following the public pound in the evidence they gave you. I think we need to be careful to be aware that there will be a substantial number of small third sector organisations who periodically will receive public money, probably relatively small sums. And in that instance, there is a requirement on the public authorities to be very transparent on the decision to grant that funding. But I think it would be disproportionate to seek those smaller bodies who've received them against that sort of backdrop to be fully subject to FOISA. So I think there's a balance to be struck there. I think you touched on earlier proportionality about the expectations, what we do, and I think that's important. So to answer your question, yes, in principle, for those larger bodies.
I mean, following the public pound is a phrase we like to use in this committee quite a lot, because of course our other hat is our audit work, and there are parallels here between what should be audited and what should be subject to FOI. But I'm interested in your response that you think, obviously, I think the committee report, I don't want to preempt it, but will be reasonable in its expectations. And I take your point about smaller organisations. But when we're talking about third sector organisations who receive substantial sums on a regular basis and are funded to that extent, 90% is a huge amount to be publicly funded. It's good to get your opinion that you think they should fall under FOISA.
In principle, yes.
Can I give you another example? So another that springs to mind would be the V&A in Dundee, which is familiar to both of us locally. Although Scottish Government central funding makes up less than 50%, by the time you add all other contributors that are publicly funded, I'm very much of the belief that takes you well over that 50% funding threshold, but it is constituted as a private organisation. Do you think, since they're spending such vast sums of public money, that that organisation should also be subject to FOI?
I'm not entirely cited on the funding arrangements of the V&A. I know Graham's desperate to come in with some...
Even the principle of it.
I understand the principle.
Yes.
And I guess I would refer you to the previous answer about the other factor here is that if you were to capture organisations like that, it can only be in relation to the public funding element of their work, not in relation to anything else. I think that places them at a disadvantage, although I guess one museum against another is an on-all comparison. And Graham's got something he can add to this.
It was simply to add, Convener, that although there has been discussion about the sort of funding levels and so on, that's not actually the test that's set out for whether or not the ministers can extend FOISA. If the ministers are going to extend FOISA using the powers that they currently have, they either need to find a public function of the body or they need to find that it's delivering a contract they need to be delivering services under contract with an existing authority that's subject to FOISA. So when we're talking about extension work, at the moment we're talking about using the existing powers that have been given by Parliament to the ministers, and those are quite tightly circumscribed. In particular, the need to find that sort of public function of the body.
Okay, that's really helpful, Mr. Crombie. The committee will look at that as we are pulling our report together. Let me give you one last example. The companies that have recently been constituted, well, Ferguson Marine was taken over by the Scottish Government, Prestwick Airport was taken over by the Scottish Government. Should they be subject to FOISA?
They are.
Fully?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to move to Liam Kerr, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. I'd like to move on to asking you about, Minister, the responding to requests, and specifically the 20-day time limit. The suggestion this committee's heard is that authorities will work to that 20-day time limit rather than trying to get the information turned around as soon as reasonably practicable. Can I ask, first of all, specifically, what timescales do you believe the Scottish Government is working to, and do you have any idea of what percentage of requesters get a response within that 20 days?
Okay, so we have clear guidance to staff, and our updated guidance tells staff that they should turn around FOI requests as quickly as practical. It says the 20 working day mark is a limit, not a target. Most requests can and should be responded to well before this. So to drill down into that, our average response time is falling. So in 2017 it was 17 days. Last year it came down to 16, and the year to date suggests it's come down to 15 days.
Thank you. The Law Society, so the committee's heard various evidence, and one of the things it's heard from the Law Society was that we need a greater enforcement initiative to ensure compliance. Do you take a view on that? Do you think there should be a penalty for non-compliance?
So is this to do with the suggestion that there should be fines levied against organisations?
Potentially, or some kind of incentive to comply.
I'm not sure that's necessary, and I'm not sure that the evidence suggests it's necessary. I think the reputational damage that's done any organisation where the Commissioner is forced to intervene can achieve the desired purpose. It certainly saw this organisation implement change and bring about considerable improvement. If you look at East Lothian Council, it went from a 30% performance level to 99.4 following intervention by the Commissioner. I think also the fact that I think I'm correct in saying that the Commissioner has never had to use his ultimate sanction of going to the Court of Session tells you that the existing powers do work.
We have heard some evidence, however, that you can use as a delaying tactic the seeking clarification possibility. So we get to day 19 and then the organisation will seek clarification to stop the clock. Do you take a view on that and what might be done to prevent that? And potentially, one of the things we heard was that the clock might pause rather than reset. Do you think that's a feasible suggestion?
I think it is. I think going back to the start of your question, our triage system internally in the Scottish Government now ensures that if there is a need for clarity, further clarity, it's identified at a very early stage. And the guidance to our case handlers in those circumstances is that they should contact the requester without delay. At that point, they're also required to provide assistance to secure that clarity. But I read the evidence that you received in that regard, and I can see the sense of a kind of pause the clock type mechanism to avoid such a situation arising in other authorities.
Thank you. Final thing from me. Do you take a view on whether 20 days is sufficient time for a response? And if not, do you think that the 20 days might be extended, or would people just work to whatever threshold you put in? Or do you put in more caveats and say, well, you can have an extension, but only in very specific circumstances?
Yeah, I think this is a really important issue. We don't favour an extension per se. I think you're right. If you look at it, the overwhelming majority of requests can be addressed in the existing timeframes. We see that. I think you're correct. A wholesale change to those deadlines, I think, would see people working to somewhere around those deadlines, and that does serve the purpose. It fails to serve the purpose of FOISA. I would have one suggestion, however, if I may, convener, around a single specific change. And that concerns Christmas and New Year, the festive season, when most public bodies either shut down completely or largely. And there is no doubt that you see a pressure build, sometimes on hard-pressed staff, to get FOIs cleared before the festive season, or they know they're coming back to a substantial workload. And I have some sympathy for hard-pressed public sector workers who find themselves in that situation. So if I may, I wonder if we were to bring in an amendment which saw the clock stopped at midnight on the 24th of December, restarted at midnight on January the 3rd, that would provide that once in the year break when everyone tends to be on holiday anyway. This year, if we had had that in place, it would have only added 3 days to the process, which is not a great deal. I accept it. It adds to the weight for receiving the FOIs, but I think on balance that's something that's worth doing. As I say, that would be the only time in the year I would suggest something of that nature, and I hope it's something that the committee might give some consideration to. But on your original point, no, I don't think we should extend it beyond 20 days. There will always be exceptional circumstances arise where the complexity or the nature of an FOI request that lead to it going on longer. But I think we're in a reasonable place with that time frame.
Very grateful, thank you.
Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Vera. Minister, I'd like to have a look at resources and the pressure on resources caused by FOIs. The Information Commissioner's annual report for 2018 and 2018-19 showed a rise of 8% in the number of FOI requests in 2018-19 compared to the previous year. Now, is the level of FOI requests sustainable given the increases that we've seen year on year?
Well, you don't need to tell us about the growth in volumes. We've seen significant growth, and we've seen within that spikes in applications. So to put it in perspective from our point of view, in 2018 we received 3,407 requests. That was 12% up on 2017, which was up from 2016. In fact, over 3 years we've seen an increase of 62% in the levels of FOI requests. And of course that places a pressure on any organisation. I think more of the pressure has come from some of the patterns. It's not just the volumes, it's the spikes that you get. As I said, we have a famous incident where we received 84 requests from the same individual in the space of 56 minutes, coincidentally the day before we were due to respond to the Commissioner's intervention. And that creates challenges for any organisation. And you will see within these types of blasts of requests some perfectly serious and legitimate requests alongside some that many people we consider to be quite frivolous. And I'm sure other organisations will see something similar. But as an organisation, you have to rise to those challenges. We've done that. From answering 76% of requests on time in 2016, we reached 91% last year, and it looks at this stage the figure for this year will be 93%, which I think is quite an achievement given the increase in volumes and the other aspects. But I think there's a bit of a misconception about how you respond to this. It isn't about necessarily throwing more resource as the volumes go up. Sometimes it's about taking a step back and reflecting on how you're dealing with those. And perhaps counterintuitively what's happened within the Scottish Government is we have gone down from having 1,000 people who, one way or another, were dealing with FOI requests to having 3 highly trained, better trained case handlers. 300 case handlers doing that. Having said that, we've more than doubled the size of our FOI unit to oversee the triage, etc. So I think it's doable, but I think organisations have to place FOI as a priority in their work. It can't be seen as an additional burden. It has to be woven into what they're doing. So I think, in short answer, yes, the pressures are growing, but I think you need to reflect on how you respond to those, and there are ways, I think, as we're evidencing, that you can do that.
Do you have any feel as to what the actual financial cost of providing this service, either through the Scottish Government or across the public sector as a whole?
We have got a rough number for the Scottish Government.
Yeah, we did some work back in 2012 and updated that, not particularly scientifically, last year. We think the average cost of a request is £234 for the Scottish Government. We haven't done it for any other authorities. we're working with our analytical services people just now in the hope that they'll be able to carry out some more detailed work early in probably April, May, because we're introducing a new case handling system, and that will, with that new start, it should give us a better way of measuring how much it costs. So we hope to get clearer information.
I mean, clearly, if we're looking at the public sector as a whole, we're broadly looking at local authorities in the main at the moment and the pressures that they're under, and that's in the evidence we've received that there's clear pressure there. It's been suggested that additional resources might be needed. Has the government thought about providing extra financial resources to help councils meet their obligations?
Well, I think I said to you earlier, it isn't always about throwing more money or more resource at it. Sometimes it's about taking a step back and considering how you are dealing with FOI requests. I know you've had other evidence that suggested a single point of contact sometimes in local authorities or individual portals. In short, the answer is no, because I think you have to, as an organisation, consider your own kind of operating model and how you might do it more efficiently. And of course, the volumes that some local authorities will handle will be considerably less than others. It would just depend.
So you've said several times about improved efficiency within the Scottish Government in providing this service. How is that best practice shared across the public sector? Because, again, looking specifically at councils, which are a large part of this, they seem to have a wide variety of processes and efficiencies in terms of providing this service. Is there any way that you can assist them, short of financial, but with maybe upskilling and so forth?
So where you have a situation where we extend FOISA, if you take that example, the government does provide support through the Commissioner. So with the last extension to RSLs, the Commissioner provided training for RSL staff, and it was about a 9-month period that ran over, again to help ensure that they hit the ground running when they are beginning to be captured by FOISA. But beyond that, our staff, we have guidance which is available publicly that we use. We've done at least one public workshop that I can think of, at least one. And our staff engage with practitioners on a regular basis. So we do try to share best practice and encourage that approach.
In your previous, you mentioned previously about the question of this one person putting in 84 requests within an hour. We've also heard in evidence that this has happened in other cases where there's sometimes hundreds of requests put out. And yet there's not many. The councils don't seem to be particularly tough on enforcing the question of vexatious requests. Is there a case for being tougher on that? It would reduce the volume.
Yeah, I think you're right now that there is a bit of an imbalance between the use of FOI by Joe Public and others. If I say to you, Mr. Beattie, that in the course of 2018, 20% of the entire FOI volume that the Scottish Government dealt with came from just 5 people. And I understand 4 of them, incidentally, were political researchers. So there is an issue there. However, I think all bodies are reluctant to use vexatiousness as I hate to use the phrase, a get out. It has to be legitimate. I think there is a genuine attempt to embrace the concept and the principles of FOI. But I think there is perhaps an argument for looking at the vexatiousness provisions insofar as currently they only cover a request or a collection of requests. There might be an argument, some might say, for looking at whether the behaviour of an individual, and therefore the individual, is vexatious. And I guess it might be possible to design some sort of scheme that allowed for that. But it would have to be very carefully drafted and drawn, and there would perhaps have to be a right of appeal to the Commissioner if someone obviously objected to that. But I think there is perhaps a conversation to be had about something along those lines.
Is this something the government is actually actively considering?
If I'm being honest, we have trusted this committee to do the work that it's doing and been keen to work with you to see what your deliberations threw up. So it's not something that we have actively looked at. I'm simply contributing to your deliberations. And I think it's important that we wait to see what this committee comes up with, and we'll give due consideration to what's recommended.
Willie Coffey.
Thanks very much, Convener. Good morning, Graham. I wonder if I could look at some issues about proactive publication and whether there should or shouldn't be a duty to record information. Firstly, the Information Commissioner in his evidence recommended removing the requirement to adopt a publication scheme and instead replace it with a duty to publish information. And I think from reading the Scottish Government response on proactive publication, we seem to be on the same territory. Is that the view of the government? And what do you think would, why do you think that would provide us with a better solution on the proactive publication side that came up several times during the committee's evidence sessions?
Well, the existing arrangement that you referred to has probably been overtaken by time. I don't think it's suitable for current purpose. So encouraging proactive publication, I think, is undoubtedly the way to go. But I think it's worth recognising that already we have huge additional volumes of information already out there in the public domain compared to days gone by. If you think about local authority websites, for example, the sheer scale of them, the amount of information that is put out there readily, I think we are, compared to where we were, say, 2 decades ago perhaps, in a much better place, although there is clearly room for further improvement.
Do you think that the kind of tipping the balance away from having a scheme to trying to encourage, either by regulation or code of practice or guidance or whatever we decide is more appropriate, would give the public more access to information than they currently enjoy?
I think it's a journey for all public bodies. I think we can all improve our performance around freedom of information, and then moving on to embracing far more widely the concept of proactive publication is the next stage on that journey. Now, there are always pressures on organisations. I mean, for the likes of the Scottish Government at the moment, there's obviously the Brexit pressure. We also, and local authorities will be the same, will be facing additional burdens as a consequence of the late UK government budget. So there's always something extra being added into the mix. But I do think it's certainly something that we're committed to doing. We have ongoing conversations, both with the Commissioner and internally, about how we can get better at proactive release of information. But we do actually put out quite a lot as it is in a variety of ways.
Okay. On the issue about duty to record or otherwise, we know that there is no duty to record anything within the Freedom of Information Act. But you must be aware over the previous evidence sessions that a number of people giving evidence have complained about the lack of the existence of things like minutes or records of meetings and so on and so forth. And it was clarified during the evidence sessions that there's no duty to record anything. The Act is about accessing information that exists or legitimate requests to create information for public interest. Where does the government stand on this issue about whether there should be some kind of duty to record things that are of importance and of concern to the wider public? And I specifically mean things like minutes, government minutes, records of that and so on. Should there be a central log of these things so that the public can get greater and better access to this kind of information that's been delivered by government and officials on their behalf?
Well, I don't accept that there's a significant problem here at all. But by way of reassurance in the context of the government, the Permanent Secretary wrote to all staff in 2018 about the need to maintain appropriate records. And our Knowledge and Information Management team are presently looking at refreshing the guidance around this. But as I say, I don't think there is a significant issue here at all. I think it's also worth considering that a duty of the type that you're calling on would capture everyone who's covered by FOISA. And that would go from a huge organisation like the Scottish Government to local authorities, all the way down to an individual GP, an individual pharmacist. So I think it's about proportionality here. And I think Severin Carroll, in his evidence to you, admitted there should be a limit, that routine matters should not be captured. And I think in a wider sense, proportionality should be at play here.
There's a section in the government's response on records management, and it says that section 61 of the Act provides for ministers to issue a code of practice on records management, but you go on to say in your response that we think that's no longer of any practical purpose. OTOs is the interesting word that was used to describe that practice there, but you go on to say that it's possibly best a matter for the keeper of the records to have a scheme of arrangements for records management. I wonder if you could just explain that a little bit in more detail, please.
Graham, do you want to?
I think I'm not sure that there's much we can add immediately to what is currently in our written submission to the committee. I think the point was that those duties in FOISA predate the modernisation of public records legislation that took place around about 2010 or 2011. And given that there is now a modern scheme of records management for public bodies set out in that specific legislation, that might be the more appropriate place to tackle records management concerns rather than trying to tackle it through FOI legislation.
Okay. My final question in the area is that you've mentioned yourself, Minister, we're in a new world really where information is packaged up in many different ways, and particularly online and on the internet. Do you see there being a need for something like an information standard, perhaps, to emerge that kind of defines the types and the shape of information that should be made available to the public? Let me give you an example. If you look on a local authority website or even a government website for documents, they tend to be fairly hefty. Is there a need in the modern world where people are looking for quick access and accessible information to provide shorter, sharper, more focused, more public consumption versions of information to make that available to the public? And should that kind of thing fall within the Act?
I'm laughing because yesterday I was at an open government forum event and was taken aback to see a presentation that was in plain English. Because let's face it, we all in this place deal with papers that are rarely written in plain English. And I have some considerable sympathy with the point that you make, Mr. Coffey. We, just by way of example, were asked as a government when we were producing statutory instruments to put a short, simple explanation for members as to what the instrument was trying to achieve. And I think there's a lesson there for local, national government and many other public bodies to actually write in a way that recognises that people need to understand this very readily and not have to walk away and reflect on what they've considered and trying to work their way through it. So I've got some sympathy at that point, although Graham's desperate to come in and...
It was only to add that already in the legislation, although it's quite a little known right perhaps, individuals do have the right to ask for a digest or a summary of information. So if it's not in a form that they find helpful, they do have the right to ask an authority to package it differently for them, if that would help their understanding.
Mr. Crombie, because I would very much like a digestible form of NHS board papers.
It's I'm
sure it does.
Any request or convener.
Willie Coffey.
Just finally, I think it's a really important point to try to make information publicly available that the public can digest easily. And rather than having a right to ask for it, should we proactively generate and create information in that format, knowing that it's needed?
I think that there's absolutely an argument for the format that it's put out there in, but I think I would just caution slightly. Very often when people are looking for information, it's a specific piece of information. You would need to do it in a way that wasn't simply a large-scale dump of information out there where they would have to work their way through it to find that tiny little nugget that we're looking for. So I think there's a balance to be struck there. And as I said earlier, I think this is about a direction of travel, and that direction of travel should be informed by the kind of points that you've made there.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. Thank you.
Bill Bowman.
Thank you, Convener. Morning. Can I change the topic to the fees and the fees cap, which I think at the moment is £600 based on £15 an hour, therefore a derived 40 hours. Now, I think in the rest of, or in other parts of the UK, there's a different cap with a different rate per hour, therefore a different number of hours work involved. We've had some suggestions and evidence that there should be a change to this. And I'd just like to ask, does the Scottish Government believe the fee cap needs to be reviewed? If so, what should it be set at? And what criteria should be used to calculate it? And have you had any discussions with any other agencies about this?
I think to answer your last point first, no, we've not been approached by other agencies on
Nor
this.
have you gone to other agencies to discuss?
Not proactively, no, we haven't. I want to bring Jerry in on the general point, and then I'll get into some of the specifics around the fee cap.
I think we're conscious that the fee cap, I would suggest we should, instead of talking about money, we should look at hours. Essentially, as you say, it's a 40-hour cap. It simplifies things to simply say it's about a number of hours. People talk about changing the various rates. Staff salaries have gone up, there's been inflation. So that confuses things when if we just say, here's the number of hours you should spend. So we think it would be good to simplify how that is presented in the Act. We are conscious that there are calls to increase the ability to charge fees, but we believe that would undermine people's information rights. So we're conscious that we should not go in that way at this time. I think that's all I would say about the fees. Graham, I think.
Are you comfortable with the 40 hours? That would be the...
I am broadly comfortable with the 40 hours, yes. In the same way as we think the 20 days works, we find that the majority of requests can be answered within that.
Really proposing a change other than to move it to hours, because that's the number that's there at the moment.
And to potentially simplify understanding around it, and possibly we don't support the calls to necessarily increase the ability to charge fees.
No, absolutely not. We don't, and I was a little bit concerned by evidence that you took about the possibility of having a two-tier system for commercial applications. I mean, it struck me reading that evidence, what would be considered a commercial request? Who would be making such a request? I mean, for example, would you see a journalist seeking information for a story that might boost the sales of their newspaper when they might argue there's a public good to be had from that? I'm not sure that's a road we would want to go down, and I'm pretty sure that's not a road the Commissioner would want us to go down either. I think where there is an argument for maybe tweaking the legislation around the ability to charge, full stop, would be to amend it to say something along the lines of that charges could only be imposed by exception, and specifically where a request can be deemed to be excessive, manifestly unfounded or repeated, and that would bring it into line with FOISA into line with GDPR.
I think I took the commercial aspect of that splitting was more not so much a journalist looking to get information, but somebody perhaps trying to do, you know, a significant volume of research, not themselves, but getting somebody else to do it. Is that a different sort of split than you would see?
Well, I think we do see that. We see people who are obviously asking for commercial information, but that involves us making a value judgment, which I don't think we should do. We should not be judging whether person X is applying as an individual or in order to save him or herself some work.
Could the Minister just repeat what you said there, how you would judge it, the three ways?
Excessive, manifestly unfounded or repeated requests.
I mean, there's a judgment in there at some point as well. You have to somehow put a guidance on that.
Well, Graham.
I think what I'd suggest though is that there's a difference between making those sorts of judgments and the sorts of judgments which would be involved, which would involve really assessing who the requester was and what the requester's purpose was, which would be what would be involved if you're trying to draw some sort of commercial, non-commercial line. It strikes us there would be a very real practical difficulty. For example, say person X routinely makes requests that are of a commercial nature for the sake of argument, but they then happen to make a separate request in a purely private capacity. Would it not then involve quite a difficult balance to try and work out what basis that person was doing that on? And that's really quite against the spirit of the legislation as a whole, to be, analysing people's motives in that way.
So just to be clear, you would retain the ability to charge?
In exceptional circumstances, those circumstances.
Well, in particular circumstances, yes. And the levels would remain the same of charging?
Well, again, based upon the number of hours that would be involved.
Okay.
Anas Sarwar.
Can I start, Commissioner, by apologising to you and the committee for my late arrival this morning. Good morning, Minister, and to the panel. I want to ask some questions about what's covered in the law and perhaps some of the gaps are in relation to emails and WhatsApp groups. Do you believe that the current legislation covers private emails and WhatsApp groups?
Yes, it does.
Yes, it does.
Yeah. And are you aware of any government ministers that use private emails?
Well, I think we have seen the press coverage that FM back in 2015 used her SNP account in exceptional circumstances to receive urgent information when she wasn't supported by Scottish Government officials.
And is that just the First Minister, or do other ministers use private email addresses?
Do not routinely use private or party email accounts, for example, for substantive government business. Such business is generally conducted in hard copy using ministerial boxes or secure electronic methods. So, as Jerry said, there was a media report about that. It was an arrangement for out-of-hours communication for a very short time in 2015. It was quite some time ago. I should say that such activity doesn't breach FOISA, GDPR or the Ministerial Code. Nevertheless, the First Minister now uses a Scottish Government email account for papers which require it to be sent out of hours, and that's the kind of lead that's followed by other ministers.
So that was back in 2015. So as it stands at the moment, there is no use of private emails by any ministers?
It would be in very exceptional circumstances. And again, we have recently released information that was sent to FM on two occasions. I think it was late in the evening for events that she was attending the next day. And we've released that under FOISA. So it is covered by FOISA. And we
Are there any recent examples in the last year, 2 years,
well, that was
an FOI, apart from that one, any FOI requests that have included?
There have been a number of FOI requests asking for information, asking specifically for information, and searches have not found anymore.
What about WhatsApp groups? Are ministers on WhatsApp groups?
That's covered. Yes.
Yeah, that would be covered if we found any information that was in a WhatsApp group. Our guidance is explicit.
But how would you find information in a WhatsApp group unless you're a member of the WhatsApp group?
Well, our guidance says to case handlers that what you need to do is ask the person involved, because that would be in a personal advice, for example, ask the person involved to do a search if they have anything that's relevant to that particular request.
Right. So is there a minister's WhatsApp group?
I'm not aware on covering government business, no.
Right. Is there a special advisor's WhatsApp group?
I'm not aware of such as well either.
Right. But if there was a special advisor's WhatsApp group and it discussed government business, it would be covered by FOISA legislation?
Yes.
Yes.
And if something was discussed on a special advisor's WhatsApp group relating to government business and it wasn't given as part of an FOI, that would be breaking the FOI legislation?
I assume so. Without knowing any specifics, you would have to judge everything on its own merits, but I would assume so.
Okay. And is there any plan to review the use of WhatsApp groups the same way it's been done with private emails?
Review in what sense?
So you mentioned the report there was around the use of a private email, so that looked at what was done going forward, and now only in really exceptional circumstances will you use a private email. You'll now use a government email address, for example, with the First Minister. Has any such conversation, discussion or review taken place around the use of WhatsApp groups?
We were not aware of WhatsApp groups that are being used for that purpose. Clearly, if that came to our attention, it's something that would be...
Are you happy to look into it and share some details with the committee about the number of WhatsApp groups that do exist, if ones that involve ministers, ones that involve special advisors, and provide that information to the committee?
Where it's relevant to government business, I'm happy to take that away and look at it.
Thank you.
We have had FOI requests about information on WhatsApp and found that there aren't a lot of WhatsApp groups. I've used WhatsApp once before for a particular business purpose. When we had the British Irish Council Summit in Glasgow in 2016, myself and 2 of my staff set up a WhatsApp group so we could be in touch with each other immediately because we were running the event. We used it for that day and then deleted it because we had no more business need for it. And it was just...
Because what I mean is it would be common practice in most workplaces, including in this workplace. So there'll be, I'm sure, political parties WhatsApp groups for individual MSPs. I'm sure there'll be WhatsApp groups for MSPs and their individual staff. So there's nothing wrong with having a WhatsApp group. I want to stress that. I'm not suggesting there is. What I'm suggesting is if it's used in the real world in other workplaces, I imagine it's used in the Scottish Government's workplace as well. And if it is being used, to what extent is it being used, and is that being an open channel and when it comes to FOI legislation?
It's not the platform, it's what's being discussed that would be captured. So if that were happening, it would be captured by this.
But you're happy to go away and look at the groups and come back with another?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Minister, can I turn to the Commissioner's intervention with the Scottish Government last year, because the Commissioner had sufficient concerns about the Scottish Government's own handling of FOI requests that they staged this intervention. I think gave you some recommendations because the Commissioner was concerned about the government's practice, and ask you, you're in charge of this, so it's great you're here today, but the practice of referring requests for clearance by ministers simply because they come from journalists, MSPs and researchers is inconsistent with the FOI principle. Have you ever been asked to clear an FOI request?
Under the current system, no. Did I see an occasional FOI request prior to that? I would have done,
Sorry,
but only an exception.
What do you mean by the current system?
Well, we have a completely different system. Would it be useful if Jerry talks you through the system that is in place following the intervention?
No, I understand what you mean. The new system's come into place since the Commissioner's intervention, and you're saying you've not been asked to approve...
You're asking me personally as a minister, yeah,
yes,
but I don't have high volumes anyway.
You've not been asked to approve any FOI requests since that new regime's come in after the intervention, is that right?
Personally, not that I can recall.
Okay, how about before the intervention?
There would have been a very small number of FOI requests that I would have seen. And it certainly wasn't based on who the requester was. It was to do with the nature of the FOI request itself.
Okay. How do you know it was based on the nature and not the requester? Because the name of the requester would be in front of you.
Because the content, the basis of seeing an FOI, and that is absolutely the case now. That's why I think it's worth understanding the basis upon which we operate in the Scottish Government. Can I bring Jerry in just to explain that part clearly for the record?
So following the Commissioner's intervention, we changed our guidance immediately on the need to consult ministers around the use of requests from journalists. So that was made the day we received the Commissioner's report. And it's now, the guidance says it's explicitly about the content, the nature of the content of the request, rather than who has made that request. We have developed guidance on case handling and how cases are decided. So there are 2 tracks. If a case is deemed sensitive and requires ministerial decision, then a sensitive case will go that way. Otherwise, the assumption that we start is that most, if not all, cases are routine, and it's only when the FOI unit receives them and carries out a triage process that we determine whether they should be sensitive.
And on the first point you made there, Mr Hendricks, you said that journalists' request, you were dealing with journalists' requests. Was it the case before the Commissioner's intervention that nearly all or all of journalists' requests went straight to ministers or to special advisors? And what is the rough percentage now?
Well, it wasn't actually the case. Our guidance, which was publicly available, said that most journalist requests should go to ministers, but it did say that ones which were not sensitive did not need to. And it also said that requests that were sensitive from any other individuals should go to ministers. So what we did was we tidied that up and simply made it clear that it was only about the sensitivity.
Okay, so what percentage of journalist requests that come in under FOI now are cleared by ministers and special advisors?
We don't record that centrally. We could possibly work it out from our stats, but we don't actually record that as a routine process.
Was that not a point in the action plan that was due to be implemented by last month?
It's a point that we are reducing it by determining that more cases are routine, and that is happening. But we haven't. You know, we are putting the processes in place now, and we haven't carried out any assessment on the actual numbers.
Do you think it would be fairer for all requests to be anonymised?
I'll answer that. I don't think it's about fairness. I think it's about practicality. There are very good reasons why the process of FOI should not be on an anonymised basis. There's a number of instances where it's necessary to do that. So where someone's looking for information concerning themselves, where there's repeat requests. I'm trying to think of some other ones that would be there.
If you're looking to determine the vexatiousness of requests, it may be that you would look at the behaviour of an individual. Therefore, you need to know that that is coming from an individual.
The key point here is it's the application that has to be seen as applicant neutral. It's not about the person, it is about the application and the consideration of that.
But surely it might be a bit fairer if you said you've got 300 people handling FOI. I was quite surprised by that.
Well, across the government and its agencies.
Sure.
Yeah.
So when the request for information comes in, if it's deemed to be sensitive enough that it reaches your desk or another minister's desk, surely it can be anonymised by that point, so that actually the minister is giving fair and impartial information.
But how is that relevant as long as it is the request that's being considered, not the nature of the requester? The key point is the request and the content of the request.
Can you be blind to the name of the requester if it's a high-profile journalist? Is it within our human nature to be blind to it, or our political nature?
I think, frankly, you're more interested in what the request says rather than who it is that's asking it.
Could I also mention that in the Commissioner's intervention report, he did say that, except for 2015-16, statistics do not show that journalists are treated in a materially different way from other requester types in relation to obtaining information. That's in paragraph 123 of his report.
Well, I think it was part of the Commissioner's intervention that the Scottish Government takes longer to respond to journalists' FOI requests than to other requests. So I think it was the Commissioner's opinion that they were treated differently.
Yeah, but not in relation to the information they received, which suggests that the decision that is being taken as to whether we release information is not influenced by who is taking that decision.
Okay.
It did take longer, and we recognise that. I think they do sometimes ask fairly complex questions, so that may add to that, but I don't have enough empirical evidence to confirm that. But our aim, as part of the intervention, is certainly to bring the average time down for all requests.
And the evidence is showing that we're doing that.
Okay, what is the role of special advisors in FOI?
Well, the Commissioner has also stated a number of times, and I was interested to see reiterated it just the other day in the Holiday magazine, that there is a transparent role for special advisors. And he's also expressed contentment with the guidance that we have around us that Jerry touched on. And that guidance is in the public domain, but I'm happy to send a copy to the committee. And the involvement of special advisors is to provide quality control when a sensitive FOI has been FOI request has been identified and will be going to the Minister.
Okay. Okay. Can I refer you to Section 5 of the Act, the 2002 Act? Mr Crombie, you responded to one of my questions earlier, I think by quoting Section 5(2)(b), and that is the section of the Act which the government is currently consulting on. Is that correct?
The current consultation that has just closed principally looks at Section 5(2)(b) of the Act, but the final question in the consultation did invite consultees also to comment on the powers that we have under Section 5(2)(a).
So that's question 7, isn't it?
That's question 7, yes.
Yeah.
Okay. And do you think there is scope for change under Section 5(2)(a)?
Change in what way?
Well, it pertains to the question I was asking you earlier, Minister, about whether it's your view that organisations, we discussed V&A Dundee, for example.
Yeah.
Section 5(2)(a) says those organisations which appear to Scottish ministers to exercise functions of a public nature. So in a way, if we were to look at 5(2)(a), it would then be within your discretion to say, well, of course, the Equality Network is 90% public funded. It ostensibly operates function of a public nature, as does V&A Dundee, because it's over 50% public funded. That's within your discretion in the Act. Would you agree?
I think it may help to explain. Ministers have, for the previous 3 extensions, taken a factor-based approach to this, and the factors that ministers have taken into account has been set out on each occasion. There's certainly nothing to stop them looking at any organisation that individuals or organisations, we receive suggestions from time to time from members of the public that we might wish to consider adding certain bodies to FOISA, and what we do is we draw those suggestions together, and when there next is a consultation, we put those into the mix at the same time. So generally speaking, there's no attempt to close off 5(2)(a), if you like. It's my understanding is that the ministers are always open to receiving suggestions as to where extension might take us next. I think ministers over the years have been quite clear that the direction of travel is greater extension, and that that's not coming to an end.
Minister?
But I take your point about the specifics you mentioned earlier. So let's take that away and we'll write back to you.
Okay, because I'm just mindful that we took evidence from Professor Dunyan, who was the previous Information Commissioner, and he suggested in his written evidence that consideration should be given to amending the law to have a gateway clause which brings bodies carrying out public functions or in receipt of significant public funds, such as the ones I mentioned, within the scope of FOISA. And I think our current Commissioner is of the same view. So that's quite weighty evidence, these men who have done this job for a number of years saying that we should have a consideration of majority of public funds. But I think you mentioned there about
changing the law to afford that opportunity.
Well, if you consider that necessary, if you think it's within the scope of the Act, I mean, you've got the legislative experts better than I do, but if you think it's within the scope of the Act to extend to these public bodies without primary or secondary legislation, then is that something you could respond to us on?
Yes. Yes is the answer. I mean, I noted the comments from the current Commissioner about the interaction of 5(b)(2) and 5(a)(2) around care home services, I think was the one. And I was struck by that, but I think he slightly misunderstood what we were doing there. Okay. It's deliberately widely drawn, but with question 7 in there, to try and ensure we do capture as wide a range of organisations as it is possible to do. Yep. So if you would like us to write back to you with a clearer understanding of the questions you've asked today, we're happy to do that.
That would be really helpful.
Yeah,
thank you.
Absolutely.
Do members have any further questions for the Minister and his officials this morning? Minister, can I say I think this has been an extremely helpful session. I think that there is a bit of a meeting of minds on several points here, so we'll put together as thoughtful and constructive as a report as we can, and if we can work together to try and resolve some of these issues, that would be extremely helpful. But thank you very much for your evidence this morning. Are we moving to private session now? Yeah, and I'll close the public part of this meeting and wish you all a very good break. Thank you.